Welcome back, folks. On the last episode of our making a Framelock folder, we got our blade profiled, cut out, of course, and we cut our stop pin track and cut our pivot hole. Then I came in, cleaned up and polished the edges. It's time now to heat treat them, and I can start working on the frames. So I'm gonna get these ready to heat treat, and we'll start cutting out some frames. So let's go down to the table. So I highly suggest, if you haven't seen it, to go back and watch the first episode in this series. And I cover a lot of things and do a lot of talking. I know it's a lot, but we really needed to cover a lot of those things because I know you'll have questions. And of course, you can always leave questions in the comments and I'll do the best I can to answer. There's a whole lot of things to build this particular pattern and style. And when it comes to tools and methods and techniques and that sort of thing. Now, you don't have to design a knife this way. You don't even have to have a stop pin track. You can just have a place for your stop pin to hit. It's located in a different place. We'll go back and look at the pattern so you can see what we're making again. So I've already cut out the blade and some scale patterns, but this is what we're making. I'm also making a drop point version that fits the same frame. And like I said, this is a particular design that I've made, and they're not all the same, of course. But for this style, using a hidden pin with a track, this is how I do it. I'm no expert at it, don't claim to be, so take that for what it's worth. I'm not a machinist either, but I get the job done somehow. So I got a piece of titanium here. This is 0.155 thick. It is knife maker grade. It is very flat. So all I'm going to do here is come in here, lay my frame patterns on here, and go cut these out, and we'll get ready to start our drilling and milling, and we'll go over some of the tools and techniques we're going to use to do that. Just a little note about cutting titanium. I use around a 14 to 18 tooth blade, and I run it on slow speed. If you run it on high, you'll work harden and it don't want to cut. Now this blade's about wore out, but I'm gonna try to get some more cuts out of it. And the reason why I use around 14 to 18 and run slow is this will gum up and work harden, like I said. So just keep that in mind, run it slow. All right, I got all the frames cut out. I'm only going to glue the lock face side on the one piece, and then I will glue these together and drill our holes, mark them and all that. And I'll show you that in just a minute because I got something else I wanted to show you. I got the blades heat treated and tempered, and now I'm going to straighten them, because after I straighten them, I'm going to surface grind them, and they'll be completely flat and straight. But I want to get them as flat as I can before I go to the surface grinder, because whether you're using a dedicated surface grinder or an attachment on a 2x72, when you suck them down to the magnet, it'll straighten it out. And then when you release the magnet, it'll go back to the crooked shape. So you're just chasing circles there. So I try to get them flat first, and I'm gonna use a carbide hammer. I know that after I just rubbed it lightly on my lap plate where the high spot is, and you can lay it here and see it, and it won't move this way. So I'm going to take a carbide hammer and come in here and evenly disperse some marks in here and hopefully not crack the blade. I have cracked blades doing this. And you just have to be careful and not get too close to this spine or to the edge here. And I'll just demonstrate here how that works. So I know my high spot ends about right here. So I'm going to start right in here. Now, I don't want to create another bow. I can kind of see as I go here, it's still got a high spot, but it's getting better. I've already straightened these two, and they are ready to put on the surface grinder. So I'll get these straight, and we'll get back on the frames. I won't go through video and surface grinding, but we'll get on the frames here in just right now. All right, and they're surface ground. I went ahead and lapped them on my surface plate with some 400 grit paper. I'll finish them up to a 600 a little later on, and you can bring them up to whatever finish you want. So I want to be pretty close to finish here, or thickness, as I can. The little bit of sanding I got to do later on is not going to affect it very much, and if it does, I'll just adjust the backspacer to make it fit right, because you want your backspacer and blade and bearing and alignment to be perfect. You don't want to be wonky like this on your fit up. So now let's start working on the frames. Before I glue these together, I'm going to go cut this lock side frame out pretty close to the line, but not all the way. I'm going to leave some space all the way around it. Then I'll come glue that to the other side. All right, I got the lock side of the frame profiled, but I left a little bit of meat all the way around. That way I can trim to it. As you could see when I was grinding this frame, that titanium puts off a very bright spark. One thing to note, when you're fooling with titanium, you don't want to let dust build up on your grinder or anywhere. This stuff is highly flammable. If you let the dust build up on you anywhere and it ignites, it's going to burn until it burns out. It's not as bad as zirconium, but it is pretty bad. So just be careful you don't burn your shop down. I've got it profiled, and I'm going to glue them up to the other frame. I'll make sure they're flat. I'll lap them on my lap plate. You don't want any burrs. You don't want to kick up anywhere. You know, a little bit of burr, throw it off, and you're misaligned. You're not square with your frame. When you put your pivot in there, you'll be off center. Now I just got to punch the holes. I got to center punch them, and I showed you how to do that with a center punch in the last video when I was center punching the blades and the tracks, and how to do it with a center punch. I use a light and a pair of optivisors, but now I'm going to show you another way to do it, because if you are not very accurate with this, with your stop pin and pivot location, you're going to be off on your blade with your track and your pivot. I mean, it don't take but 2 or 3 thousandths and you're screwed up. So here I'm going to be using an optical center punch. Basically what it is a magnifier with a set of crosshairs in there. I'll show you a shot of that here in a second. Put them in there. You line this up on your crosshair. Take this out while you're holding it down, and you'll drop in a center punch and punch it. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to line all these up, then I'll glue them to the frames. I can't remember where I got mine, but I'll look for it and leave a link in the description. Now, I learned this trick, or the use of this tool, from Mike Stewart with Ecom Knives. He had some videos I've mentioned before years ago on YouTube. I don't even think he makes knives anymore, but that's where I learned about the use of this tool, and it's been a great one. So let me get these done, and we'll move on to the frame drilling. Okay, I got everything punched except where the detent ball is going to go. I'm only marking these. I'm not going to drill them just yet. I'm just marking them because I'm going to take this off later on after I do the profile, and I'll be cutting that slot down the road, as well as drilling the detent ball hole. I don't want to do that right now until I release the lock. Optical center punch, get you one. And now we're going to start drilling some holes. Now I'll go over the tools or the drills and mills that we need as we go along. And a lot of this depends on your design, you know, screw head size, whether you're using button heads or socket heads, what size your pivot is. I'm going to be using the 3/16 pivot. Now I am going to be doing something a little different on this build. I'm trying it. Normally I drill my stop pin all the way through. It's a 1/8 stop pin, but I drill it through and countersink a button head, and it's exposed. And what I mean by that, you can see there is the stop pin with a button head holding it. What I'm going to do this time, something I'm trying, and if I don't like it, I can always ream it out drill it out to 1 inch and countersink some screw heads. But I'm going to hide the stop pin on the show side. So I'm going to use a smaller bit to go in here, drill all the way into this scale about 40 thousandths. Then after I separate them, I'll ream those holes, and the same this way, except I'm not going to go all the way through with 1/8 on the lock side. There'll be a small hole there. You'll be able to see the pin, but it won't be this giant screw there. On the show side, you won't see anything. So I'll be using a small bit to drill that. For now, I'm going to take a 1/8 spot drill and spot the pivot and these two frame holes. I'll be using a spot drill that just goes in there, and it's a centered bit that opens it up a little bit, so when you come in with your larger bit, you're centered. After I do that, I'm going to take a number 13 drill and drill all the way through, and then ream it to 3/16 with a reamer. This hole here is going to be a 5/64 drill. I'll drill all the way through, and then I will, when I do make the back spacer, it will be tapped, and I will be sinking screws into the back spacer. That hole will be smaller. I'll drill the frame holes out with a larger bit that'll let the screw pass through after I install the back spacer and drill the holes for it. Now I've just got a couple 321 machinist blocks in here. They're very square and flat. You want to make sure that's all right before you start punching your holes through your frame. Like I said, I use nothing but carbide, especially on titanium. And you need to run it fast. You'll find that titanium is very sticky. You can break bits pretty easily, but it likes high speed. However, for this spotting hole, I'm going to be running slow because I'm not changing the belts because I know what I'm doing next. I'm just pecking it anyway. I'm not going down in it. That's all I'm doing is just open it up a little bit. It's centered. And if you notice, I let the bit kind of center itself in the hole. I take my hands off of it a little bit, then I hold it down once it's centered. Now I'll go ahead, put in our number 13 bit, cut our primary hole. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and drill our holes for our frame screws. And I'm using the tapping size bit here for 256. I'll drill through, come back later, put the spacer in, drill through the spacer, take the scales off, and drill them out for a pass-through. But this way, I need to, hold off on that till I get the spacer done. I'm just going to use high speed. I got this thing on the highest speed it'll go. I'm in a drill press, and I got everything square. I got me a stop rather here. And I'm also going to drill the stop pin hole undersized, way undersized, because I'm not going to have it come through. It's going to be hidden in there, but I'll only go about 50 thousandths into this scale. I'll be using peck drilling because you want to clear your hole of chips and not cause wallow and cause this bit to break. These things are sticky in titanium. Carbide, high speed on a small bit like this. And every time you go through, you need to clean your burr off. I'll go over to the lap plate this quick. And it's done. And we'll drill the next one. So now I've got my stop set for this hole, and it'll stop about 50 thousandths into this next scale. That's it. No hole on this side. All right, with our holes drilled for our 256 screws, these are just thread size, our lock pin located, our lock bar located as well. Now it's time to match this scale to this one and finalize the profile. A couple ways we can do that is trace this, knock this off with a rubber mallet or something similar, and clean them up and then match them by grinding them. Or you can just cut this excess off and grind them together while they're glued together. You just have to be careful because if you get it too hot, they'll separate. After that, I'll separate them. We'll make a backspacer, punch through the backspacer with the thread holes, then separate these and go through them with a pass-through bit for our 256 screw. Now you can separate these scales by just putting them in acetone and letting them sit a while. I just don't like to wait that long, so I use heat to separate them and then drop them in the acetone, clean them up. Now before I move on to the next step, which is start doing my counter bores for bearings and my pivot heads and our screws, I want to go ahead and get the backspacers drilled through with the thread size, which is what I've got drilled in here. I'll drill straight through all the way through. Then I can drill the pass-through size in the scales or in the frames. But I need to do this first before I forget and drill these out, and then I'll be misaligned trying to line those back up for a thread size. So I'm gonna get these profiled. We'll come in here and I'll set them in here, glue them on. They'll be roughly profiled, and I will drill through. And then I can tap these and finish profiling later. They'll just be rough at this point. Now before going, you notice there's one missing here. That's because I went ahead and done just what I was about to do these other three. I've got the backspacer made and went ahead and tapped it and fit up the stop pin. Now I'll have to do some adjusting here. This is just temporary to hold it together, but my spacing is correct in here. There's 20 thousandths on each side of this blade, which is what it'll be when I'm done, after the pockets are recessed for the bearings. Now that we got our pass-through holes cut for our 256 screw, it's time that we'll cut the pockets for the head. Now I'm using a button head 256 screw, which means that this is like 0.165 or something like that. I'm gonna be using a 0.166 carbide counter bore to do that. This one's already cut, as you can see, and it'll go in here and make this cut. I'm gonna go down about 60 thousandths. If I need to adjust these holes depths later on when I contour these, It's easy to do. I'll set it in there, bump it a few more thousandths to keep these heads below the surface. Now I'm using temporary screws until my final fit up and contouring of the handles is done. That way I don't waste screws hitting them with a belt or what have you. I can also go ahead and thread the back spacers. Okay, it's time to start threading the spacers, but just want to mention, you can cut all of these pockets, bearing pockets and all that with drill and mills, but you have to take a lot of time to line them up, and if you get off, you screw it up. I made a whole lot of them that way till I started using counterbores, and that really saved me a lot of time and aggravation. Now we're going to go ahead and thread our back spacers. I'm going to be using a 256 tap. It's a thread forming tap. This tap works great for titanium. It will form the taps into the bored hole there. It doesn't really cut shavings out. It kind of compresses the threads in there. Now, I don't drill these. If I had a Tapmatic, I would, but I don't hand drill them and stuff like that because they're too thick. I've done broke many taps trying that. So I use a hand tapper. Now, if you're doing liners, like 50 thousandths liners, you can drill those with no problem, but I still use this thing because it's quick, it's accurate, it's a straight hole. Use a little tap fluid there, and I just start it in. I let the tap center itself. You can see I'm letting it go. That way I don't put it in a bind. It looks wanky, but it works. Now, I'll go ahead and lap this on my lap plate because it'll have a little burr right there, and then tap the other one. I just want to show you something before we move on. A few years ago, I put an old digital micrometer on my drill press and used it to make folders. So you can use a drill press, but it takes an awful lot of setup and alignment and holding everything to do counterbores. But you can do it. And this is rude and crude, but the battery's dead right now, but it worked. You know, I could do depth cuts with it. Like I said, pretty crude, just an old digital micrometer. I don't even use it anymore, but it's there if I need it. Anyway, just an idea. All right, I've got all of the back spacers tapped, and I test each one of them in the frames, and I put the pivot pin in there to make sure everything lines up. That pivot pin should come in and out without any forcing or twisting or anything like that. Because if you got anything off from here to there, it's going to show up. And if it's off at this point, I don't even continue. So I test it because you can't just wallow a hole out and make it work. So now it's time to cut the bearing pockets and the lock pin pocket that's on the inside. It'll look like this one, where I've got a 1/8 stop pin hole there. Like I was showing you before, there'll only be one hole on one side of the frame. The show side won't have a hole. So it's countersunk in there, but it's drilled and reamed for a 0.125 pin. So this one I've already made and tested. But we're going to have to do that on the next video because we're out of time. If you got any questions, just leave them down below. I'll do the best I can to answer them. I want to thank my patrons, and I want to thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next part.